Now, Freedom of Religion South Africa is heading to court to demand the lifting of the current ban on religious gatherings. The organization says it wants the same treatment as casinos and restaurants, where people can attend under certain conditions. The faith-based organization also wants religious workers to be recognized as essential service workers. Let's unpack this now with Michael Swain, Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa. So you're clearly unhappy with government. Take us through your legal arguments for the ban on religious gatherings to actually be lifted.
Well, essentially, the legal argument is a constitutional one. The Constitution clearly gives, in fact, greater rights to the religious sector than to any other sector of the economy, under Section 15, for example. And yet we have a situation whereby we see that certain gatherings, similar gatherings to what would take place in a religious context, are permitted. Casinos, for example, as you've mentioned, restaurants, health clubs, etc. And yet, for some reason, there is a complete and indefinite ban on all faith-based gatherings. And that, frankly, unless government can show us the data, the scientific data, upon which it is basing its decision to, as I say, impose this absolute ban, then it is not fair. It is arguably unfair discrimination and therefore unconstitutional. And unless they can show it, of course, then that is an irrational restriction of a very fundamental constitutional right.
Yeah, but as South Africa experiences the second wave, which is dwindling in numbers currently, is this demand realistic, or should we wait for the numbers to get lower than it is so that religious gatherings can actually happen, like we saw previously?
Well, I think the answer to that is that just because you can open doesn't mean to say you have to open. So, for example, we don't really see that there's any logical distinction between a restaurant owner being entitled to open their restaurant and, of course, people being able to make the decision to whether or not they go to the restaurant, and a religious leader who arguably is a responsible person in the community with the congregation's best interests at heart, being able to open or not a place of worship. And again, people making their own choices as to whether or not they attend. So we don't think that this is a justifiable or rational restriction at this stage. It typically applies to all religious gatherings. So, I mean, to give you for instance, you and I could go to a casino. We could sit side by side at slot machines. But if at some point we decide we actually now want to pray together, that would then be illegal because it would be considered a religious gathering. Similarly, if we get into a car park and we're in a car park with closed windows listening on a church premises to a radio sermon, for example, that would be considered a religious gathering and illegal. So it just doesn't make sense. And I think, therefore, that's why we're going to court to ask for a review of these regulations so that the court can decide, is this, in fact, justifiable? Is it proportionate? And should it, therefore, be allowed to continue?
You also want religious workers to be recognized as essential service workers. Why?
The religious sector has, right from the beginning, been actively engaged in really frontline work. Much of the food distribution, much of the support in the communities, the distribution, even the provision of shelter, has been provided by the religious community. And they have been recognized under level 3 as essential workers. But of course, the problem is that if you ever go back to the level 4 or level 5, then they would not be considered to be essential workers. So we simply want this clarified. There is no doubt that the religious community has made a massive contribution, and the president himself has recognized as such.
And is that because you would also want them to get vaccinated first?
No, that's not the issue. The issue is that they would be allowed to function and operate in society as they always have. The religious sector has always been in the front lines when it comes to any form of pandemic, and that's throughout all human history, really.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Michael Swain, Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa.